All right. Good morning and welcome. Let me just real quick share my screen. All righty. Good morning. My name is Isaac, and I am a historian here at Edison and Ford Winter Estates. Today, we will be discussing In Defense of Fort Myers. This is going to be the story of Fort Myers itself, the actual military fort that was located here, as well as a lot of the history surrounding Southwest Florida. And so please join me as we discuss this digitally. All right, so here we have Defense of Fort Myers. There's a great picture of the blockhouse. All righty. So why is there a fort in Fort Myers? As a historian here at Edison and Ford, I get this question every single day. Um, they say, what happened to the fort? Where is the fort? Is there actually a fort here? Um, and so I wanted to do a kind of a deep dive in that and share that here. And so the history of Fort Myers is tied to a long and conflicted past. There were four wars, different armies, different peoples, and all of this led to the Fort Myers that we know today. The history itself starts with the Seminole Wars. So I want to start with the First Seminole War, which took place 1817 to 1818. Now, the First Seminole War came about due to a number of circumstances. Tension between the U.S. Army and the Seminole tribe following the War of 1812. And so, a little history there. The Seminole tribe is a very interesting history. And one of my fellow historians, Carolyn, actually goes into the whole history of the Seminole tribe in her presentation. And she'll probably be recording that within possibly May or the month following May or June. So keep an eye out for that if you want to do a real big deep dive into the actual Seminole tribe themselves. But they are an amalgamation. Um, of a number of considered multiple different tribes, including the Creek tribe, is kind of like the largest bulk, uh, which were normally situated in Georgia, but otherwise it's been made up of a number of people from the Carolinas, Alabama, and indigenous tribes of Florida. Now, during the War of 1812, Britain fought against the United States, and they enlisted the help of the Seminole tribe. And then following the War of 1812, obviously those tensions were high. Not only that, but the Seminole tribe would let in escaped slaves, escaped African Americans, and ultimately Florida was owned and controlled by Spain at this point in time. And so a lot of escaped slaves would travel south into Florida and actually join the Seminole tribe. Um, this would lead ultimately to high tension, and the U.S. Army would attack a Seminole village called Foultown in Georgia. And in turn, this leads to a retaliatory attack by the Seminoles. And all in all, it starts this conflict. And General Andrew Jackson, of course, $20 bill, President Andrew Jackson, but General at the time would take over command of the army, and he would fight his way into Florida, taking over small towns, villages, pushing the Seminole tribe further and further south, really washing away their influence up in Georgia. Ultimately, this interaction would it would lead the U.S. to take over a good chunk of East Florida. And officially, the First Seminole War ends in a stalemate. And ultimately, this is pretty difficult for Spain to control this little piece of land, of course, over the sea that is now, as the U.S. is pushing into. This leads to the Adams-Onis Treaty, in which case, uh, signed by President Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams, Spain would cede Florida to the United States. And so you can see on this picture, I have the actual the diagonal lines here is the area ceded by Spain. So that was in 1819. Now, this would not ease the tensions. Ultimately, this would slowly but surely, it was a pressure cooker. And in 1823, there was the signing of the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. This would give, as you can kind of see in this photo, this image, this dark area in the center of Florida, that was a reservation that was given to the Seminole tribe. They're like, this is Indian land, is what they called it. And ultimately, they would sign this in, and so they had their own land in Florida. All is all right. The U.S. start to settle this new territory, this Florida territory, and slowly but surely they want more and more land as they're going down, and it leads to again more tension. And ultimately, in 1830, Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act, which authorizes the forceful removal of Native Americans from east of the Mississippi, relocating them to Indian Territory, which, if you don't know, is Oklahoma today. As you can see a number: Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, Choctaw, all their different paths that were pushed over into Indian Territory. And ultimately, this would end up leading to the Second Seminole War, which was the bloodiest war of the Indian Wars, which is this chunk of different wars against a number of Native American tribes. This war was also called the War for Indian Removal, and it was from 1835 to 1842. 1832, the Treaty of Payne's Landing was signed, but was followed by disagreement. So this treaty essentially was between seven Seminole leaders in the U.S. government, and they essentially were trying to convince them to relocate over to Oklahoma. And it came down to this situation where they wanted to invite them to Oklahoma to see if the land was suitable. And so they brought them over. They came back, and the document was signed saying, yes, the land is suitable. And so the U.S. Army says, all right, you guys can move over there now. And they said, no, we don't want to. And it's a bit blurry. Some of the officials of the Seminole tribe said they didn't even sign this, or they were coerced into signing this. I saw one article that discussed that they just thought they were going over there to say, yes, this is suitable land, not we agree to move. And so U.S. government wasn't too happy about this. A year later, the Seminole tribe again was coerced into signing the Treaty of Fort Gibson, which was very similar. That basically said, this treaty basically said, we agree to follow the Treaty of Payne's Landing. But again, this would lead to disagreement. And then finally, in 1834, now President Andrew Jackson would authorize the removal of the tribe by force. And in 1835, whilst leading 100 soldiers, Major Francis Dade was sent down. He's the U.S. Army. And he was moving from a fort to fort across Florida, and he was ambushed and killed by a party of Seminoles. And this officially marks the beginning of the Second Seminole War. And as you can see in this image, there's the death of Major Dade. Now, over the course of the 6.5 years of the Second Seminole War, more than 300 encampments, forts, and other military defenses were built throughout Florida. It's the reason we have Fort Lauderdale today, and eventually Fort Myers, but of course, that's what this presentation is about. A number of smaller forts still exist: Fort Ogden, um, Fort Brooke, which is today known as Tampa, but it was Fort Brooke. And the story itself of Fort Myers would begin with Fort Dulaney. And so this is just an image here of Florida with a number of forts all around it, as you can see. Fort Frank, um, Fort Brooke, Fort Meade, Fort Dulaney, Fort Dallas, all the way at the bottom there. Fort Jefferson, that was actually built a little bit later. Fort Dulaney. So we got this image. Really cool old map from 1839, which covered different forts. And so you can see that we have the Caloosahatchee. We have Sanibel right there. And then in 1837, built at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River on a piece of land called Punta Rasa. You can see that's basically just the little tip of the southern coast of the Caloosahatchee there. That was where Fort Dulaney would be built in 1837. It provided a defensive position at the mouth of a river, and it acted as a supply depot for the army. Now, the cattle trade has been prevalent in Florida since Spain first came to Florida. And actually, the cattle we have, that the cattle they were farming and herding back in this day were officially those were descendants of the cattle that Spain first brought over to the United States. The Texas Longhorn is actually also a descendant of these initial cattle brought over by Spain. And a lot of these cattle would get driven down to Punta Rassa and were shipped out essentially from Fort Delaney, even during this time. And if you can see on this map, Fort Myers does not exist. It would be right where the Caloosahatchee gets really wide, right where it starts to get thin, that little area. That's where Fort Myers is today. Now, unfortunately, these settlements were not designed to be permanent. They were made out of wood. Almost every single fort during this Seminole War, during the Second Seminole War, was built out of wood. And Fort Delaney itself was just a small little outpost. It was not permanent. It would be abandoned in 1838, briefly, just the garrison would move out. And it was reestablished again, though, by 1841 in the fall. Unfortunately, for those Floridians, fall is hurricane season here. And in October 1841, a hurricane would level Fort Delaney. It would wash out most of the coastal lowlands there of Southwest Florida. All of the structures would be destroyed, and two soldiers were actually killed in this storm. Um, After that, Western Division headquarters, which is up at Fort Brooke, up in Tampa. Here's a picture of actually Fort Brooke, well, an illustration. They would order the garrison to move from Fort Delaney to upriver to a better position. And a scouting party would find the perfect spot about 15 miles northeast of Punta Rassa, right on the shores of the Caloosahatchee. It's a little bit inland. The river turns, it gets thicker. It's about 2 miles at its longest back in that day. And it starts to get quite thin after the curve as it cuts east. There's a freshwater creek nearby, and it is just in a nice central location. This would be the modern site of Fort Myers. But it wasn't Myers yet. The garrison would build an encampment in the shape of a semicircle, about 3 blocks in length along the river, about 2 blocks deep inland. And they would name this fort Fort Harvey after First Lieutenant John Harvey, a soldier from this regiment who had died before he could regroup with the garrison. The fort itself was relatively simple. It consisted of a wooden stockade, a wooden wall that went around this, tents, and a pier or a dock for access to the river. Now, ultimately, the Second Seminole War would continue. More than 1,500 U.S. troops' lives were lost in the war. Over 3,000 Seminoles would be relocated over to Oklahoma. And ultimately, the garrison would get orders to move out and abandon Fort Harvey. And ultimately, this would be not too long after an end to the Second Seminole War. Only a few hundred Seminole, estimates about 500 uh, Seminoles survived and remained in the swamps, pushing further and further into the Everglades. In 1842, the signing of the Armed Occupation Act, which encouraged white settlement throughout Florida. There's a few rules here. You had to be a white male resident of Florida and not having 160 acres of land in Florida when asking for the permit. You have to get a permit from the lands office. He and his heirs should reside for 5 consecutive years on the grant, clear, enclose, and cultivate 5 acres of land during the first year, build a house on the lot during the first year, and the land should be 2 or more miles away from a garrisoned military post. So essentially, we have all these military posts. As I said, 300 encampments, but that's going to be about 80 actual serviceable forts with stockades and barracks. And so basically, they're filling out around these forts slowly but surely. There's a lot of forts all over the state. Now we have all these people coming down and starting to settle. And officially, the Second Seminole War would end August 14th of 1842. And so I do have this as a permit um, going over essentially a family receiving this land. Now, there would be I said a peaceful watch. I think I meant a watchful peace, but honestly, they both work. That would follow the end of the war, but slowly but surely that would change. Florida becomes a state in 1847. It is the 27th state to join the Union, right after Michigan, the 26th state. I'm from Michigan, that's why I said that. Uh, there's a whole state now of lands and rivers, and the U.S. starts to push further south and take its claim, even pushing into the swamps. This gentleman here, this is Governor Thomas Brown, first state governor of Florida, and he would request the Secretary of War to remove the Seminoles, as he has plans to start draining swampland and clearing it out and making more space. And so a push was made to start patrolling waterways and rivers, to open roads and build roads through Florida, and to build even more forts, encroaching slowly but surely into the Everglades and other marshy swampland around southern Florida. Uh, and we got more orders from Fort Brooks. Again, Tampa's calling. In February 15th of 1850, Tampa would Major General Twiggs, this gentleman right here, he would order Brevet Major Ridgely of the 4th Artillery to take command of two companies of artillery heretofore detailed and proceed to the Caloosahatchee River. He will select a suitable place for the establishment of a post and immediately throw up such light works as may secure his stores and remove from the Indians any temptation in which his isolated position may give rise. Essentially, find a good spot out there. To put, a nice defensive spot. This post will be called Fort Myers by order of Major General Twiggs. And so, why Fort Myers? So this suitable place that the army would find was the abandoned Fort Harvey, which wasn't anything super special. Ridgely would rebuild the encampment, and it was named Fort Myers after Major General Twiggs' future son-in-law, as he would say, to show respect for his future son-in-law and make his daughter happy. His daughter was Marion, and she was betrothed to this gentleman right here, Colonel Abraham Myers. So who is not part of the garrison of Fort Myers, but it was named after him by his future father-in-law. Ultimately, it was still a great place. Fort Myers, a great position. And so they would build Fort Myers here. And I don't know where my head's going to be for the actual video. But as you can see, this was a sketch of the fort itself. And so this is right on the Caloosahatchee River. Just kind of pointing out some things. We got a pier going out 1,000 feet to a wharf. We got a bathing pavilion. We got officers' quarters right along the water. We have a hospital. We have parade grounds right in the middle there. We have more officers' quarters to the right of that. Kitchen. We got a number of barracks. We got a railway, so they could receive goods from the water and rail things down into the camp. Um, Ultimately, we got a number of stores, bakehouses, a carpenter shop, guard house at the bottom, and then you can see this nice square that goes around this. This is all the wooden stockade. And so, nice big wooden wall. There's gardens a little bit further down. And right in the center, right at the bottom, is a bowling alley. And so, what makes a fort? Here we have this little diorama on the right. This is a little miniature of the fort that the iMac had set up as an exhibit. And so you can see all these little structures. Fort Myers, it was larger than Fort Harvey, and this new fort contained not only defensible structures like stockade, not stockage, and a blockhouse. It included as well a blacksmith shop, a carpenter shop, stables, a hospital, all these things I just mentioned. And so, just kind of going into some of these things, stockade, they were a standard practice for these forts in the 1830s, well, 1800s and the 1700s. It was a large wooden fence that went around the fort, wide, rectangular, typically made from sharpened logs, not brick or stone. Not a lot of quarries in southern Florida, not a lot of large amounts of stone. And stone was expensive to ship down. And so they knew these forts weren't going to be the most permanent things in the world. And so they quickly could build them, make a quick defensive position out of local trees. This is a little image for my canopy. And then blockhouses were a very standard design for forts. They were popular in going even further back. History shows that even back in ancient Greece, they had these similar structures as towers. But a blockhouse or guardhouse, it's a small wooden fortification, the ones that we used in the 1700s and 1800s. As you can see, this is an illustration of the Fort Myers blockhouse. It worked as an elevated defensive point. A lot of times you'd have these, like in the last photo, at the corners of the stockades. You're a little bit higher, you can look out, and ultimately there'd be openings on all four sides. And you could have cannons, you could have rifles, you'd be able to keep a watch on all four sides. Um, Usually not the most roomy space in the world, but it got the job done. This one has a way you can get all the way up to the top, uh, outside and inside. And then this is another little diorama of the Fort Myers blockhouse, as you can see. There's a cannon there. Now, ultimately, parade grounds were a very common part of these forts. They would be this nice, wide, open space right in the center of the fort. This is where officers would assemble their men. This is where officer soldiers would drill and gather in formation. And usually, the officers' quarters and the barracks were around this structure, kind of like similar to this image. This is another image, just not of Fort Myers, but of parade grounds in general, to show what that kind of situation would look like. Now, bowling. Nothing like some nice bowling in the Florida swampy wilderness. But bowling has been around for hundreds of years. Nine pin bowling, which people started to gamble on, and it became a big problem that the United States illegalized nine pin bowling, and now we got 10 pin bowling because it's different. And so here is just some images of some outdoor bowling alleys of similar time periods to the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s. It was an outdoor activity back in the day. In 1800s Florida, that was no different. And perhaps this was a sign that this fort in general was more permanent than the previous Fort Harvey or even Fort Delaney. Um, as you know, they have luxury outdoor activities like this. Alrighty, back at it again. The hostilities between the army and the Seminoles was not yet over. There would be increasing amount of settlers that would build more tension throughout southern Florida as they're again settling more and more on land. Further down, even the swampland that the Seminole tribe was currently living in. And in December of 1855, the U.S. Army would destroy a Seminole plantation in the Everglades, officially kicking off the Third Seminole War. So the Third Seminole War, which was 1855 to 1858, um, was a series of small skirmishes that would occur throughout southern Florida. This was really a war of attrition. There weren't a lot of resources for the Seminole tribe, and so they would do what they could to attack moving caravans, get supplies where they could. The U.S. Army did the same thing. It was incredibly hard to track down people that were accustomed to living in the swamps and the Everglades. And so if they could, they would attack farms and attack, as civilian supplies, things that could stop them, really kind of put a hold on them trying to survive. Ultimately, this would lead up to many of the Seminole tribe to resign. This is Billy Bowlegs right here, who was a prominent chief and figure in the Third Seminole War. Ultimately, he would end up surrendering and be relocated to Oklahoma. But ultimately, there'd be a small handful that were never captured and remained in Florida, officially unconquered. Um, which is why we have the Seminole tribe of Florida and we have the Seminole tribe of Oklahoma today. Seminole tribe of Florida owns Hard Rock Cafe, if you weren't familiar. All locations owned by them. And so they were unconquered and they survived in the swamps. And now we have a fort without a war. Fort Myers would, like Fort Harvey, be abandoned. They did not need to have constant garrisons throughout the state. And though it was not a stranger to local cattle drivers in the town, it was still a very popular area for the cattle trade. And so slowly but surely, they would check out this fort, and the cattle trade literally went right through Fort Myers. While the Seminole Wars were officially over, there was one more war for Fort Myers. And that, of course, is the Civil War. The Florida cattle trade, like I mentioned, it was very popular, prominent trade in the area, and it was a very large supplier to the Confederacy of their beef, their food that they would eat. This is an officer's illustration of Fort Myers, by the way. And ultimately, there was a small Union garrison of soldiers stationed at Useppa Island, which is off the coast of Fort Myers. And this small garrison would travel inland and reclaim Fort Myers for the Union. And so during the Civil War, Fort Myers was a Union Army base, one of the very few in Florida. It was at one point the only Union Army base in Fort Myers. The Union Army would take over a few later on, but this would act as a base of operations for the Union Army and to specifically disrupt the local cattle trade. If they could stop the food supply from going to the Confederacy, they would do what they could. Now, in response, the Confederate Army defended their cattle operation. Local Florida militia, made out of local residents, these local cowboys themselves, really, would be established into the Cattle Guard Battalion or the Cow Cavalry. They did not ride on cows, if you're curious. They rode on horses, but they protected the cows. Ultimately, tensions would rise, and this would lead to the Battle of Fort Myers. And so the Battle of Fort Myers was the southernmost battle of the Civil War. There are locations in Texas that also claim otherwise, but this is the southernmost land battle in Florida, during the Civil War, and I stick with it. February 1865, the Confederacy sends more than 200 men to attack Fort Myers, possibly up to 400 men, and they would come down from Tampa. Similarly, the fort itself was defended by over 200 men, around 250 sources I read, and it was garrisoned by men from the 2nd Florida Cavalry, a company of the 110th New York Volunteer Infantry, and the D and I companies of black soldiers of the 2nd Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. Um, and ultimately, this battle, which was not the bloodiest battle in the world, it was not um, super crazy. It was basically something close to a stalemate. They're shooting guns and cannons at each other. Fort Myers did not have a lot of ammunition, a lot of guns themselves. Uh, the Confederacy did not know that. And ultimately, the battle would end with officially one Union casualty, a black soldier from the United States Colored Troops. Um, Up to four were injured, possibly more deaths followed by the war itself. And then the Confederacy, from the research I've done, had quite few injuries as well. But it would end with a Confederate retreat. And so officially, Battle of Fort Myers was a Union victory. Now, ultimately, the Civil War would end and the fort would be abandoned one last time. Um, but to many local cattlemen, this was now an empty chunk of land ripe for the taking. And little by little, cattle drivers and other settlers would move into Fort Myers. They would dismantle old wooden structures, dismantle the stockade, get rid of these old structures that are, frankly, getting rotted away. And they would build their own shacks, their own houses. The cattle trade of Florida, the cracker cattle is what they're called. And the crackers themselves were these cattle drivers that used bullwhips. They had their own cracker cattle structures and cottages, and we do have one that was built right here on Edison and Ford Winter Estates. And it was here when Thomas Edison bought the property. This was built after in 1870s. But here we have a picture of some prominent women of the town. Mrs. Hendry, Fay Hendry's wife, who was a local. He actually fought for the Confederacy. Here's the cistern, and this is behind them is another one of the wood structures that had been built around this time period. This cistern was part of the original fort. Now, ultimately, what remains? Remnants of the past. The fort does not live forever. Fort Myers would grow, soon becoming a town following Thomas Edison arriving here. They weren't even officially incorporated as a town. The county seat of this county was in Key West. And so if they wanted to do anything, they had to travel down to Key West. And it was becoming a problem. When Thomas Edison showed up, they weren't officially a consolidated town. And they said, well, if people like Thomas are going to visit, we might as well become an official town. And they would talk to the capital of Florida. They would get township. And ultimately, they would become the new county seat for this brand new county, Lee County. Lee County, named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And so even though Fort Myers was a Union Army fort, it is now the county seat of a county named after the Confederacy. But that's because the people that remained were, a lot of them were Confederates. They were part of the Cow Cavalry. Ultimately, little by little, a lot of these structures would get torn apart, and the final remnant of Fort Myers officially, the last structure was an old officers' quarters that had been turned into a library. And you can see I actually have some excerpts here from the 1930s. Located on Bay Street, just back at the post office, the oldest building in Fort Myers. This building was quarters of General Winfield Scott Hancock during the Seminole Indian War and the Union headquarters during the Civil War. And it was turned into a library, but unfortunately, it was falling apart. It wasn't well taken care of. People like Mina Edison, they wanted to preserve this history as best they could, but ultimately, it would get torn down in 1937, the last official piece of the fort. And so people ask, is there a fort in Fort Myers? There is in our memories, but not on the streets. This is just an image, courtesy of the IMAG, of what the officers' quarters would have looked like or similar buildings. The fort. This is a really cool image of an overlay of the initial fort over top of what there is today. As you can see, we've gone further into the river. We've built on wharfs. We've built boardwalks, dumped in earth and moved things over. The river's gotten a little skinnier than it was, but you can see that it basically Bay Street, Lee Street, in between Broadway and Royal Palm Avenue. That's where it would have been today. That cistern I showed earlier. This is where the Sidney and Burn Davis Center is today. But it's just kind of cool to see the remnants here and what possibly would have made. And you can see that things like Lee Street go right up through the town, almost perfectly next to these other structures and buildings, and they really built off of this. This is a historic memorial sign here of Fort Myers. So in this vicinity, Calusa Indian villages were located in ancient times. And I have another presentation on YouTube, if you want to check that one out. I talk about the Calusa tribe. But around this site, in the Seminole War of 1841-1842, a fort was established and named for Lieutenant John Harvey. The fort was reestablished in 1850, Fort Myers, and the Seminole War ended in 1858. In the war between the states, Fort Myers was once again reactivated as a base to ground up wild cattle to supply beef to federal gunboats patrolling the Gulf of Sanibel. This is what we have here today, but essentially a lot of what I had said. Now, I have quite a few works cited here. There's a lot of fun information out there. I really liked Go Down and Rawchuk yesterday's Fort Myers. They had a lot of really cool images. That's where I got some of these maps. I think this one was actually from Cynthia Williams' Hidden History of Fort Myers. Now, ultimately, I do want to invite all of you to come back Tuesday, April 15th, 2025. That's going to be next Tuesday. And join Holly Schaefer for a digital discussion. The topic will be the history of women in baseball. This will be at 10:30. You can register online at EdisonFord.org, and you can find the Zoom link in the calendar. And speaking of the great Holly Schaefer, my Battle of Fort Myers was only one slide long. She has a great presentation that's already on our Edison Ford YouTube about the Battle of Fort Myers as a whole. It's a 40-minute long presentation. And so if you want to deep dive specifically more into that, I recommend you watch her video. I didn't want to step on her toes too much. But on that note, my name is Isaac, and I have been your historian. I want to thank you guys for coming out here today. Do you have any questions for me? And thank you, Kathy. It was my pleasure. Alrighty. On that note, thank you all so much, and you all have a fantastic day. And I will end my slide.